I can't begin to tell you how many grandparents are raising their grandchildren and sometimes their great-grandchildren when they're supposed to be living their life. They're raising their product, their descendants. And that, socially was not the way we planned it. So everybody needs some support around this, and as African heritage people in particular, one of the reasons why there is such a disparity is because we keep fluffing over the idea that there's still racism against African heritage people. It is not necessarily overt because, I live in Louisville and I happen to love Louisville. 2 of my children live in Atlanta, and most of y'all know that Atlanta is run and predominantly operated by African heritage people. But Louisville is a great place to be. They love Louisville too, even though they live elsewhere. Louisville's a great place to be. There are wonderful human beings here of all races, nationalities, ethnicities, and your heritages. But there is a core, I call it like when people have heart conditions and they go in and they put the balloon in to clean out the heart condition. They call it angioplasty or something like that. They don't get all the clog out. There's still some residue. Well, we still have a residue of racism in this community. And I don't feel it because, I'm Janine Shakir for real. And, it just happens like that. But I can tell you many others do, and the young people are the worst ones. One of my sons is a proud graduate of Morehouse College. He was gone for 5 years and was back in Louisville before I could get here after graduation. And I think it was 2 days after he got back in Louisville, he got stopped at White Castle's on 2nd and Market, 1st and Market. Don't ask me what for, he didn't get a ticket. So it still happens. My oldest son was stopped 10 times by police officers before I could get him out of Louisville. No tickets, no arrest. So I said this to a police officer one time, and he said, well, don't you think maybe you did something to get stopped like that? Well, of course, no, was the answer. Because I have each time it happened, and he didn't get arrested, no citations, so evidently the officer didn't find anything. And he says, well, we're just doing our jobs. I said, yeah, but each officer has one incident or event with my son, but my son had 10 events. So as an African heritage male, how does he feel? If that usually is what's happening, if he's not being convicted of anything. So we just have to suck it in and admit that there is an underlying issue of racism. And now we also have the issues with the refugee community. We don't talk about them, but they're African heritage. So we have to look at that too and how that's coming along, because if we ignore the immigrant African refugee community, watch out.
Flex a little bit because, there are people in poverty of all races, yet they do not end up in the juvenile justice system at disproportionate amounts. My mom and dad grew up in rural Arkansas, poor, working as sharecroppers in the cotton fields, and not one of their siblings ended up in the juvenile or the adult justice system. So we know that all poor people don't commit crimes, and so poverty can't be just the contributing factor. What we have to look at, again, is put all things back on the table. And we have to go back, especially over the last few decades, and look at some of our responses to violence and how those responses, be it in policy or be it in legislation, have affected or adversely affected the minority population. It was interesting that a lot of our safe school policies across the nation and a lot of our zero tolerance in school violence policies and legislation that have come as a result of Columbine and Paducah. Now it's funny how a couple of white kids go into school and they shoot up the schools, and then we come out with these policies and procedures, and the end result is that African Americans and minorities across the nation end up being caught in the juvenile justice system at disproportionate amounts. So now we have to go back and look at some of those policies and some of those laws that are on the books that adversely affect minority communities, and not just zero in on any particular risk factor. I do agree that poverty has something to do with juvenile delinquency, but that's across the board. It's not just African American kids. I do agree that low achievement in school affects juvenile delinquency, but again, that's across the board. So we've got to broaden the perspective a little bit and put some things on the table that were responses to some of the behaviors of the past, and now look at the result of some of the zero tolerance policies, look at the results of some of the safe school policies. I don't think having police in schools and criminalizing what was once just schoolyard misbehaving is good for minority kids. When kids act out in school and we criminalize that and we use that as a doorway into the juvenile justice system,